Today we're at the Guelph Civic Museum, and joining me is Dr. Eric Payseur. We're going to take a look at Wellington breweries with Dr. Payseur. He's a guest curator at the museum, and he's also done a lot of other curation work and has written extensively about things historical, obviously, in this region. Welcome. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you.
It's a great display, isn't it? I mean, I really feel like I'm in the middle of the downtown of the old city here.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's talk about the name, I guess, that most people associate with the breweries in this region, certainly from an historical perspective, and that would be the Sleeman Company. They obviously had an important role to play in producing beer, but they also had a much more foundational, almost, importance to the development of the whole city.
That's right. Sleeman was the first mayor of the city of Guelph. When it was incorporated, he was on the committee to incorporate the city as a city. He was the president of the Guelph Maple Leaf baseball team, which won a world championship in the 1870s. Of course, he had a vested interest.
And you got to have beer at the ballpark, right?
Absolutely, right. So, you know, in some ways, he was sort of creating that connection of beer at the ballpark. Declaring Dominion Day, for example, here in the city, which had the dual purpose of providing more leisure time for workers in the city, but also it meant he's going to sell more beer as well. So he sat as mayor of the city, on city council. Other early brewers in the city, some other brewers were also sitting on city council, so they were a part of this. And so really the story of these early breweries in Guelph is one of the economic development and the development of the city of Guelph, right? In terms of that, for example, in the 1890s, he helped fund a railway in order to get his workers from St. Patrick's Ward, where many of them live, to the West End, where his brewery is located, right? So building that public infrastructure, right, was something that helped develop the city, but also, of course, helped get his workers to the brewery faster so they could be more productive.
Right. They were mayors and they were benefactors to the city, and they did charity work probably and had things named after them, but it really wasn't that altruistic, was it? I mean, this was pure business. Create an environment where they can get their product around to different parts of the country and, in fact, North America.
That's right. And, you could look at some other industrialists who were very conservatively minded and said, we want to maintain a 10-hour workday, for example. We don't want workers to have more leisure time. That means they could be engaged in more union activities, or they'll be in more drunkenness, immorality, very paternalistic kind of view in the late 19th century. And
I certainly think of the meatpacking industry as it grew up in America too, the same kind of factors at play.
That's right. But Sleeman had the foresight and the business acumen in order to realize that, look, if we give the workers more leisure time, they're going to consume more of my beer. So that worked out well. And it also had, in some ways, one could argue that it had some kind of dampening effect to the conditions, working conditions, and that unions were protesting and worker activisms were protesting, advocating for an 8-hour day or for additional public holidays for more worker leisure, and then hence the Guelph Maple Leaf baseball team and other initiatives that kind of melded these very different competing interests.
The popular myth, I guess, the urban myth we might call it, is of the Sleemans and sort of rum running and this sort of underground transportation of beer during Prohibition era. We see it in the TV commercials currently. Is there any truth to that at all that you can determine?
I don't think there's archival evidence to support that, right? But as we know, advertising campaigns don't rely on archival evidence. There's lots of unregulated terms that people use.
Very good. Tell us a little bit about the beer that was being actually brewed here, whether it was by Sleeman or not. Do we have an idea of what kind of beer they were drinking? Was it a Germanic? Was it an English type beer, Scottish type beer?
Yes, initially all the brewers coming in the mid-19th century were immigrating from England. They all have proper English names, as the Sleemans were from Cornwall in England. And so traditionally the beer that people were drinking and that the women kitchen brewers and inns and taverns were brewing initially were ales, because they tended to have higher alcohol content and could be transported and preserved longer without the modern technologies that we think of today. George Sleeman was actually influential in kind of these technological innovations and expanding Sleeman breweries with biosulfate of soda and being able to create lager. And I think one could also say German immigrants coming to Kitchener-Waterloo had a big influence, and workers started to prefer the Pilsner-based beers coming out.
So going away from the
originating in the Czech Republic in the mid-19th century, but German immigrants really bringing these notions of brewing, and so Sleeman was picking up on that and also creating these innovations, trying to address the working class consumer tastes.
He was obviously very influential, and he was obviously a big player. But even in terms of what we're seeing today, how much other smaller production was going on at that time in concert with Sleeman's production? Are we talking dozens of breweries? Are we talking tens of dozens?
Well, sometimes they weren't always recorded, right? So someone would come from England and start a brewery, and then they would get in financial trouble and they would go back, and so they're just listed as a name, for example, in ledgers that try to record who's brewing, or the census. They're listed one year and they're not there the next, or maybe they were there and they were trying to avoid taxes or those kinds of things. But I think you can say that there were at the time the Sleemans are setting up in the mid-19th century, you're looking at five to six kind of key players that are involved in brewing in the city for at least a more extended period of time, right? Not discounting those that are just here for a year or two
and then just drop away.
Yeah.
Given that, what are your parallels maybe that you can draw between then and now with a burgeoning craft brewery scene we see here, in terms of numbers, and what are the characteristics that may be similar?
Well, I think it's important to remember that these brewers are coming to Guelph in part because of the clean water source for the brewery, right? And there's evidence that some of them actually tried to replicate the excellent water conditions of well-established breweries in the UK, and to test the waters here in Guelph, but basically they're locating here in Guelph because of the springs, because of the Speed River, the access to good quality water for the brewing process. Also because of the Grand Trunk Railway and the connections to Toronto and to the States as well, being able to access those markets, which Sleeman did quite effectively. So that's very similar today with the microbreweries happening in really since the late 80s and 90s here in Guelph, but located in the sort of Wellington Waterloo, surrounded this wonderful agricultural land where you can source local ingredients. So I think that's an important part of the microbrewing kind of tradition, if we can call it that now, since the 90s, that where brewmasters are looking to source as much as possible locally, use locally grown hops. So there are well-established hop growers and malters here in Wellington County that are providing ingredients and getting creative and adding other ingredients, wildflowers and other things that are native or et cetera to beers, right?
Well, Dr. Eric Payseur, it's been a pleasure talking to you and mining the rich historical background you're bringing to the conversation. And the conversation, in fact, is making me quite thirsty to talk about
Yes,
beers.
let's have a beer.
Thanks very much for helping us out.
Thank you.